My name is Helen Ward, and I am 76 years old. I never thought I would reach a day when I'd feel unwanted in my own family. For most of my life, I believed love was something you built with sacrifice. I thought that if you gave everything, your time, your money, your heart, then the people you loved would never forget you. I was wrong. I realized that on the afternoon of my last birthday, when my son Ethan and his wife Claire invited me to what they called a small celebration. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a soft blue dress I had kept for special occasions. It matched my eyes, or at least that's what my late husband used to tell me. I carried a small box of handmade cookies for my grandchildren and a framed photo of the whole family taken years ago when Ethan still smiled when he saw me. The sun was shining, and I remember telling myself, "Don't cry today, Helen. It's your birthday. Maybe this time they'll remember who you are." When I arrived, the front door was half open. I could hear music playing, laughter, children's voices. For a moment, I felt warmth. I imagined they had prepared something nice for me, maybe a cake, maybe even a card from the kids. I rang the bell anyway, out of habit. Claire opened the door, her face slightly flushed from cooking, or maybe from irritation. "Oh, you're early," she said, not really smiling. "We weren't expecting you for another hour." I looked at my watch. It was exactly the time she had told me. "I thought the invitation said 3, I said quietly. She shrugged. "Yeah, well, people are still arriving." Behind her, I saw Ethan talking to his friends near the kitchen, a beer in his hand. He didn't even notice me at first. When he finally turned, he lifted his hand lazily in greeting, the kind of wave you give to an acquaintance, not your mother. "Hey, Mom," he said, not moving from his spot. "You made it." I wanted to hug him. I wanted to hear him say happy birthday, Mom. But instead, he turned back to his conversation as if I were one of the neighbors. I stepped inside and saw that the decorations were all for Liam, my grandson. "Oh," I said softly, "is it Liam's birthday too?" Claire turned to me, her lips curling into that polite smile she used when she was uncomfortable. "We decided to celebrate both of you together. It's just easier that way." My birthday had always been in March. Liam's was in February. But apparently, easier meant pretending mine didn't exist. The children ran past me, laughing, holding slices of pizza. "Grandma Helen," little Ava shouted, giving me a quick hug before being pulled away by her mother. "Don't get her dress dirty, honey," Claire said sharply. The word stung, not because of their meaning but because of the tone. I sat quietly in the corner of the living room, clutching the box of cookies I had baked that morning. I had imagined handing them out to the kids, seeing their faces light up like when they were younger. But no one asked about them. No one asked about me. I just sat there, invisible in a room full of people who once called me family. As the afternoon went on, I realized the party wasn't for me at all. No one mentioned my birthday. There was a big cake for Liam, a mountain of presents, music, dancing. When it was time to sing, everyone gathered around the table. I stood behind them, smiling through the ache in my chest. They sang "Happy Birthday, Dear Liam," and when the song ended, Claire looked around as if suddenly remembering something. "Oh, and for Grandma too," she said, almost as an afterthought. The children clapped, not really knowing what was going on. I forced a smile and whispered, "Thank you." Ethan handed me a small paper bag. "Here, Mom, from us." Inside was a box of vitamin supplements and a pair of socks. I tried to say thank you, but my voice caught somewhere between my throat and my heart. I looked at the cookies, still sitting unopened on the table. No one had even touched them. After everyone left, I offered to help clean up. Claire hesitated. "That's okay, Helen. You're a guest. You should rest." Her words sounded kind, but her tone told me I was a burden. I gathered my purse and coat, forcing a smile. "Thank you for having me," I said. Ethan finally looked at me then, just for a second. "Drive safe, Mom." No hug. No warmth. No goodbye kiss like when he was little and wouldn't sleep without one. I stepped out into the cold evening air, holding the paper bag with my gift and the cookies no one wanted. The laughter from inside echoed behind me, fading as I walked to my car. On the drive home, I kept replaying the day in my mind, searching for the moment when I had stopped being part of their lives and become just an obligation they tolerated. I couldn't find it, but I felt something inside me breaking, quietly, without noise, the way ice cracks underwater. When I reached home, the house was dark and silent. I set the cookies on the kitchen counter and sank into the chair by the window. For years, I had convinced myself that loneliness was temporary, that families simply got busy. But that night, as the clock ticked past midnight, I realized it wasn't time that had made them distant. It was choice. They had chosen to forget me, to see me as someone who existed only when convenient. I thought about the years I had raised Ethan alone after his father's accident, the nights I worked extra shifts at the diner, the mornings I walked him to school in the snow because we couldn't afford the bus. I had promised myself back then that I would make sure he never felt unwanted. And yet here I was, 76 years old, sitting alone on my birthday, unwanted by the very person I had given everything for. That night I cried softly, but it wasn't the kind of crying that comes from sadness. It was the quiet weeping of someone who has finally seen the truth after too many years of lies. Somewhere deep inside, something shifted. I didn't know it then, but that night was the beginning of the end of the woman who accepted everything just to be loved. The next morning, I woke up early, though I had barely slept. The faint light of dawn filtered through the curtains, painting long shadows across the room. I sat up slowly, feeling the ache in my bones, the same ache that had been growing these past few years, not the ache of age, but of emptiness. I made myself tea and stared at the steam curling into the air, remembering the sound of Ethan's laugh when he was a little boy. It was pure, innocent, the kind of laughter that fills a mother's heart with purpose. I remembered how, every year on my birthday, he'd bring me a drawing from school, crayon hearts and shaky handwriting that said, "I love you, Mom." Somewhere between those childish notes and yesterday's paper bag of vitamins, I had lost him. Or maybe he had lost me. I went to my living room and sat in my favorite armchair, the one beside the old bookshelf. On the top shelf was a faded photo album I hadn't opened in years. I pulled it down and flipped through the pages. There we were, Ethan at 10, holding his first fishing rod, Ethan at 17, standing beside his prom date, Ethan at his college graduation, where I'd sat in the front row crying with pride. Then there was his wedding photo. I remembered how nervous I'd been that day, wanting so badly to make a good impression on Claire's family. I had paid for half of that wedding, $12,000 I'd saved from years of serving coffee and pie at the diner. I had done it gladly, without hesitation, because I believed love was measured by sacrifice. But over the years, the thank yous grew fewer. My phone calls went unanswered, my advice turned into interference, my presence into inconvenience. When Ethan and Claire bought their first home, I gave them $20,000 as a gift. They called me an angel. But soon after, I became the old woman who didn't understand how modern families worked. When they had their first child, I babysat almost every day for 3 years. I changed diapers, made lunches, sang lullabies, and watched cartoons until my eyes burned. Claire used to thank me then, but her tone changed once she went back to work. "Mom, you should rest more," Ethan would say, but what he really meant was stay out of our way. Still, I kept showing up. I kept loving them, even when it hurt. I remember the winter 2 years ago when their heater broke. They called me in a panic because the repair cost was high. I sent them $3,000 the same night without them even asking twice. Then came the car repairs, the school expenses, the vacations they couldn't afford but wanted to take anyway. I helped with all of it because that's what mothers do, or at least that's what I told myself. In total, I must have given them nearly $50,000 over the last decade. I never kept count until that morning. For the first time in my life, I started adding it all up in my head like a quiet accountant of my own heartbreak. As I flipped through more photos, I reached a picture of me holding baby Ava in my arms, just hours after she was born. I was wearing the same blue dress I'd worn at my birthday party the day before. Back then, it had been new, crisp, full of promise. Now, it felt like a symbol of something that had faded, my place in their lives. I traced my finger over the photograph, feeling the smooth plastic under my skin. I had aged, yes, but it wasn't time that had made me invisible. It was love given without boundaries. I had built my entire identity around being needed, and when they stopped needing me, I ceased to exist in their eyes. The phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. For a second, my heart leapt, it might be Ethan. But when I picked up, It was the pharmacy reminding me to refill my prescription. I thanked the clerk and hung up slowly. My house felt too quiet, the kind of silence that hums in your ears until it becomes unbearable. I turned on the television, but even that felt wrong. Every channel seemed filled with noise that couldn't drown out the emptiness inside me. That afternoon, I decided to go for a walk. It was chilly, but I needed air. I walked through the neighborhood park where I used to take Ethan when he was little. The trees were bare now, their branches reaching out like old hands. I watched children running and mothers chasing them, their laughter echoing across the playground. I wondered if those women knew how precious those moments were. I wondered if they realized how quickly time would take them away. On a bench near the pond, I met Mrs. Green, an old friend I hadn't seen in years. She was feeding the ducks, her hair white as snow, her smile tired but kind. "Helen Ward, is that you?" she said, squinting. We talked for a while, catching up. She told me about her daughter who had moved to another state but called her every day. "We talk for hours," she said proudly. "She says she worries about me." I smiled faintly and nodded, though something twisted inside me. I couldn't remember the last time Ethan called me just to talk. I had become the one who called, who reminded him to visit, who sent messages that went unanswered. When I returned home, it was already dark. I made a small dinner, soup and toast, and sat at the kitchen table alone. The chair across from me was empty, as it had been for almost 20 years since my husband's heart attack. I spoke softly into the air, as if he could still hear me. "You be disappointed, Thomas," I whispered. "You tell me to stop crying, to stand up for myself. But how do you stand up to your own child?" My voice broke. "How do you accept that the people you raised stopped loving you?" I went to bed that night with swollen eyes and a heavy chest. But as the moonlight fell across my window, something began to stir inside me. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was realization. A quiet, steady awareness that love without respect isn't love at all. I stared at the ceiling and thought of everything I had done for them, everything I had endured. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question that I had buried for years. What if I stopped giving? The thought frightened me, but also, it felt strangely freeing. Before I fell asleep, I made a promise to myself. I didn't know what form it would take yet, but I swore I would never let them humiliate me again. The woman they saw as weak and dependent was gone. They just didn't know it yet. The next few days passed slowly, each one blurring into the next like a long gray thread. But inside me, something was changing, subtle at first, then stronger with each sunrise. I started to see my life not as something happening to me, but as something I had allowed to happen. For 76 years, I had been the caretaker, the giver, the one who apologized first even when I wasn't wrong. I had thought that kindness guaranteed love. Now I understood that sometimes kindness just teaches people to use you without guilt. On the third morning, I received a letter in the mail. It was from the local bank, a reminder about my savings account. I had opened it years ago when I sold my husband's old truck and the small property he'd inherited from his parents. I had almost forgotten about it, but as I read the letter, a quiet idea began to take root. I went to the bank that afternoon. The young teller smiled politely, typing my name into the computer. "You still have a healthy balance here, Mrs. Ward," she said. "Would you like an updated statement?" I nodded, pretending not to care, though my heart was racing. When she handed me the paper, I glanced down. The number startled me, more than I remembered. Between old savings, insurance payouts, and the bit I'd earned selling antiques, I had over $200,000 sitting untouched. I had always kept it for Ethan, for the grandchildren, for family emergencies. But suddenly, for the first time, I thought, what if the emergency is me? I walked out of the bank with the statement in my purse, my steps steadier than they'd been in years. The autumn wind brushed against my face, cool and alive. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew I wouldn't spend the rest of my days waiting for phone calls that never came. That evening, I sat at my desk and took out a sheet of paper. I began to write, not a letter to Ethan, not a note of complaint, but a plan. I listed every account, every asset, every item I owned that mattered. I started marking who I wanted to leave them to, and who I didn't. For the first time, Ethan's name didn't appear on every line. The next morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer. Her name was Rebecca Morris, a sharp, kind woman in her 40s with eyes that saw through pretense. She greeted me warmly when I walked into her office. "Mrs. Ward, how can I help you today?" she asked. I hesitated at first, feeling foolish, like an old woman who didn't belong in places like this. But then I remembered the way Ethan had looked at me at that birthday party, distant and different, and the shame melted into determination. "I want to change my will," I said firmly, "and I'd like some legal advice about transferring my assets." Rebecca nodded without surprise. "All right," she said, taking notes. "Do you have family?" "Yes," I answered. "A son and 2 grandchildren." "And you want to exclude them?" she asked gently. I looked down at my hands. The veins stood out sharply, the skin thin and pale. "No," I said slowly. "Not exclude. But I don't want my love to be something they collect when I'm gone. I want to use it while I'm still alive." She smiled faintly. "That's a powerful choice." Over the next hour, we went through every detail. My accounts, my home, my insurance, even the small jewelry pieces I had inherited from my mother. Rebecca helped me set up a trust in my own name, giving me complete control. She also showed me how to allocate part of my funds to charity, something I had always dreamed of but never dared to do because Ethan used to say, "Mom, you don't have enough for that." I realized now that his voice had been one of quiet control, the kind that sounds protective but is really possessive. When I left the lawyer's office, the air felt lighter. For years, I had been shrinking, physically, emotionally, spiritually. But that afternoon, as I walked past the rows of shops and coffee houses, I felt taller somehow. Not in body, but in spirit. I stopped at a cafe and ordered a cappuccino, something I hadn't done in ages because it's too expensive, Ethan used to say. I sat by the window, watching strangers hurry by, and smiled. The world hadn't changed. I had. That night, I started cleaning my house, not the usual kind of cleaning, but the kind that feels like exorcising ghosts. I opened drawers, boxes, cabinets, every corner filled with memories. Letters, old school certificates, birthday cards Ethan had made as a child. I read each one carefully, tears sliding down my face, but this time they weren't tears of pain. They were farewells. I packed them into a single box and wrote on the lid, "For the life that was." Then I carried it to the attic and left it there, closing the door behind me. A week later, Ethan called. My heart jumped when I saw his name on the screen, though I reminded myself to stay calm. "Hey, Mom," he said, his tone casual. "Listen, Claire and I were wondering if you could watch the kids this weekend. We've got a party, and our babysitter canceled." For a moment, I almost said yes. My old habit stirred, the one that made me say yes before thinking. But then I remembered the empty birthday table, the unopened cookies, the cold voices. I took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, dear," I said gently. "I won't be available this weekend." There was a pause on the line. "Oh," he said, sounding surprised. "Are you going somewhere?" "Yes," I replied. "I think I'll take a little trip. Somewhere quiet." He hesitated again, then said, "Okay, well, maybe next time." "Yes," I said softly, "maybe." When I hung up, I felt a wave of strange freedom rush through me. For the first time in years, I had said no, and the sky didn't fall. I didn't lose my son. I didn't collapse in guilt. I simply sat there, alive, breathing, finally my own person again. That night, I opened my laptop and started searching. I looked up towns by the sea, quiet cottages, senior communities where people actually laughed. After hours of scrolling, I found a small coastal village called Windermere, about 3 hours away. The photos showed pastel houses by the water, markets filled with flowers, and benches overlooking the ocean. Something in those pictures called to me, as if the place was whispering, "Come here. Begin again." The next morning, I packed a small suitcase, locked the door behind me, and drove away from the house I had lived in for 40 years. I didn't know if I was leaving forever. All I knew was that I was finally leaving for myself. The road to Windermere was long and winding, cutting through fields of gold and forest shadows that seemed to whisper stories of freedom. I drove slowly, letting the hum of the engine drown out the thoughts that had haunted me for so long. With every mile that passed, the weight on my chest grew lighter. For 76 years, my life had revolved around others, my husband, my son, my grandchildren, but that morning, for the first time, it belonged to me. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. There was a strange peace in that anonymity. To vanish quietly from the map of their lives felt like reclaiming something I didn't know I had lost. When I arrived in Windermere, the air smelled of salt and lavender. The ocean stretched endlessly beyond the cliffs, a living thing that breathed with slow, eternal rhythm. The town was small, stone cottages, cobblestone streets, little shops selling handmade soap and seashell crafts. I found a modest inn run by a woman named Margaret. She must have been close to my age, though her spirit was younger. She welcomed me as if I were an old friend returning home. "You're lucky," she said as she handed me the keys to a small room overlooking the sea. "Few people come here by accident. This place calls to those who need peace." I smiled softly, wondering if she somehow knew the story written behind my quiet face. That first night, I stood by the window, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. The sky was painted in hues of violet and silver, the kind of beauty that humbles you into silence. I whispered to myself, "This is what freedom feels like." And for the first time in years, I slept without tears. Days turned into weeks, and I found a rhythm that soothed me. Every morning, I walked along the shore, collecting shells and pebbles. I began talking to strangers, other retirees, travelers, artists. There was a small cafe near the harbor where I'd sit with a cup of tea and my notebook. I started writing again, something I hadn't done since I was young. At first, it was just memories, small fragments of my life, but soon they turned into reflections, lessons carved out of pain. The owner of the cafe, a kind man named Daniel, noticed me there almost every day. One morning, he came over and said, "You write like someone who survived something." I looked up, surprised. "Maybe I have," I said with a smile that carried both sorrow and pride. Daniel started saving my favorite seat by the window, and sometimes we'd talk. He was in his early 60s, widowed, gentle in a way that didn't feel pitying. He told me about his late wife, about how he'd built the cafe in her memory. There was something healing about our conversations. Two souls who had lost but still chose to keep living. He once said, "You know, Mrs. Ward, people think revenge means hurting others. But the best kind of revenge is living better than they ever expected you to." Those words lingered in me for days. One afternoon, I walked past a community board near the market and saw a notice, "Volunteers needed at the Windermere Women's Shelter." Something inside me stirred. I called the number that same evening, and the next week, I started helping there. The shelter was small but warm, filled with women of all ages, some young, some my age, each carrying her own story of betrayal, pain, and resilience. I listened to them, comforted them, taught them how to budget, how to rebuild, how to start again. They began calling me Miss Helen, and soon they started confiding in me like daughters. I found myself laughing again, truly laughing. One day, the shelter's director approached me. "You've been a blessing here," she said. "We're struggling to keep the doors open, though. The donations have slowed down." I looked at her, then at the women around the room. Faces filled with the same loneliness I had once carried, and I knew what I wanted to do. The next week, I returned to the lawyer, Rebecca, and told her to allocate part of my trust fund to the shelter. "I wanted to stay open for as long as possible," I said. She smiled. "That's a noble cause, Mrs. Ward." I shook my head gently. "It's not noble. It's necessary. I gave my life to people who didn't value it. Now I want to give it to those who will." Back in Windermere, I continued my new routine, writing, volunteering, laughing, living. Months passed. My hair grew whiter, my steps slower, but my heart lighter. Then, one Sunday morning, as I sat at the cafe, my phone rang. I hadn't changed my number, though part of me wished I had. It was Ethan. My hands trembled slightly before I answered. "Mom, where are you? We've been trying to reach you." His voice carried a mix of confusion and guilt. I took a slow sip of tea before replying. "I've been away," I said calmly. "Needed some time for myself." There was a pause. "Well, Claire's been worried. We thought maybe something happened." Something had happened. I had finally started living. But I didn't say that. "I'm fine, dear," I said. "How are the children?" "They're good," he replied, then hesitated. "Look, about your house. We had some mail come for you. And, we were wondering when you'll be back." His tone shifted, Uneasy, practical, the same tone he used whenever money was involved. "I don't think I'll be coming back, Ethan," I said gently. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I sold the house," I said simply, "and I've made some new arrangements." The silence that followed was sharp, almost electric. "Sold it? Without telling me," he said finally, his voice rising. "It was mine to sell," I replied softly, "just as it was my life to live." "Mom, that's crazy." "We could've." "Could've what, Ethan?" "Used it, rented it, inherited it," I said, my tone steady now. "You never asked me what I wanted. You only remembered me when you needed something." "Mom, that's not fair," he said defensively. I smiled sadly. Neither was forgetting my birthday. He went silent. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I heard the waves outside, calm and endless, while he breathed unevenly on the other end. "Are you angry at me?" he finally asked, his voice quieter now, almost childlike. "No," I said. "I'm not angry anymore. I was once. But now I just understand." "Understand what?" "That love isn't something you owe your mother only when it's easy. It's something you live by. And you stopped living it, Ethan. So I learned to stop waiting." There was nothing more to say. I wished him well, told him to take care of the children, and hung up. I sat there for a long time after that, watching the tide roll in and out. My hands trembled a little, but my heart felt steady. The chapter with Ethan had closed, not with fury, but with peace. That evening, Daniel joined me at the cafe again. He didn't ask questions. He just smiled and handed me a small seashell. "For courage," he said. I placed it in my palm, feeling its smooth surface. "Thank you," I whispered, "but I think I finally found it." The months after that call slipped by like slow tides. I didn't count the days anymore. Time and Windmere moved differently, softly, kindly, without hurry. I had stopped waiting for phone calls, stopped checking the mailbox with hope, stopped measuring my worth and how much others needed me. Instead, I began measuring my days by how much peace I felt when I woke up and how much gratitude I carried when I went to sleep. Every morning, I would walk to the beach with a cup of tea and sit on the same worn bench overlooking the sea. I would watch the sunlight spill over the water and the gulls wheel in the air, and I would whisper small prayers, not for forgiveness, not even for strength, but for stillness. It became my sanctuary, that quiet strip of sand where no one knew my past and no one expected anything from me. The shelter flourished under the donation I had made. Rebecca handled everything perfectly, ensuring my funds were used wisely. The women there began new lives. Some started small businesses, others returned to school, and a few even reunited with their children. Seeing them rebuild themselves piece by piece filled me with a kind of pride I had never felt before. It wasn't the pride of a mother whose son succeeded. It was the pride of a woman who had finally succeeded in saving herself. Sometimes, the past tried to creep back in. Once, I received a letter forwarded through my lawyer. It was from Ethan. He wrote that things hadn't been easy. That Claire was angry I'd sold the house, that money was tight, that they missed me. He didn't say he loved me. He didn't apologize. The words felt like they were written not from regret, but from discomfort. He ended the letter by asking if I could help them get back on their feet. I read the letter twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer. Then I wrote a short reply. "Dear Ethan, I am happy to hear from you. I truly hope you and your family are well. Unfortunately, I can't help financially. I've already committed my resources elsewhere to something that keeps me alive and gives me purpose. You once told me to rest more, remember? I've finally learned how. With love, Mom." I mailed it without anger, without bitterness. Just calm truth. After that, the letter stopped. For a while, that silence hurt, but then it became freedom. As winter rolled into spring, Daniel and I grew close. Our bond wasn't romantic in the way young people imagine love. It was gentler, steadier. We shared quiet dinners, stories, laughter that healed instead of burned. One evening, as we sat by the shore watching the sunset, he said, "You know, Helen, people spend their lives chasing big things. Money, success, recognition. But sometimes the biggest victory is simply walking away without hate." I nodded, smiling faintly. "I used to think walking away meant giving up," I said. "Now I see it's the bravest thing I ever did. We fell into a comfortable silence after that, the kind where nothing needs to be said because everything that matters already has been. A year after moving to Windermere, the town held a small festival by the harbor, music, laughter, lights strung between poles, children chasing bubbles in the evening air. I helped at a booth for the shelter, selling handmade crafts made by the women we supported. As I handed out bracelets and candles, I noticed a young mother holding her daughter's hand. The little girl had the same blue eyes Ethan once had as a boy. For a moment, my throat tightened, but then I smiled. The sight no longer hurt. It simply reminded me of all the versions of love I had lived. That night, when I returned to my room, I opened my notebook, the same one I had started on my first week in Windermere. It was now filled with pages upon pages of memories, lessons, and quiet truths. I decided to write the last entry. My hands trembled slightly, but my mind was clear. I once believed love meant giving everything until there was nothing left. But now I know real love begins when you give to yourself. The people who forget you teach you what it means to remember your own worth. The ones who leave remind you that you can stand alone. I used to be afraid of dying alone. Now I see, I never was alone. I just hadn't met myself yet. I closed the notebook and placed it on my nightstand beside the seashell Daniel had given me. The sound of the waves outside was steady, eternal. Somewhere deep in my chest, peace settled like a warm blanket. Weeks later, on a calm Sunday morning, I didn't wake up. Margaret found me sitting by the window, still and smiling, the notebook open on my lap. The sunlight streamed across my face, and for anyone who saw me, it looked like I was simply lost in thought. The town mourned me quietly, gently. Daniel organized a small service on the beach. No grand speeches, no tears of pity, just a few friends, a few words, and the soft hum of the ocean that had been my last companion. My ashes were scattered into the sea, as I had requested. The water took them slowly, lovingly, just as it had taken all my sorrow. A few weeks later, Rebecca delivered a final letter to Ethan and Claire, as I had arranged. It contained no accusations, no bitterness, just truth. Dear Ethan and Claire, if you are reading this, I have already gone where silence finally heals everything. I want you to know I loved you both, and I always will. But love is not ownership. I gave you life, not obligation. Whatever you choose to remember of me, I hope it teaches you one thing. Never take for granted the heart that waits for you. It won't wait forever. Be kind to your children. Be kinder to yourselves. Learn what I learned before it's too late. With peace, Helen. Ethan read that letter many times over the years, though he never spoke about it. But people said he changed afterward. He started calling his children every day, listening to them more, hugging them longer. Perhaps guilt softened him. Or maybe, just maybe, my silence spoke louder than my words ever did. In Windermere, the shelter continued to thrive. They renamed it Helen's Haven in my honor, a place where women could find strength when they thought they had none left. A small plaque by the door read, "Founded in memory of a woman who learned that love, when reclaimed, can change the world." And somewhere beyond the waves, in the place where souls finally rest, I imagine Helen Ward smiled, free at last, loved by the only person whose love she ever truly needed, herself.